Wealthy parents turn their backs on their disabled son, but a kind-hearted gardener opens his arms to him, and fate reveals just how wrong the parents were. The sound of a baby's cry echoed through the lavish, pristine room of the private hospital. Joseph Gordon, a well-known businessman, stood outside the delivery room, his nerves tense as he waited. Time dragged on, feeling like an eternity, until finally the door swung open, and a nurse stepped out holding a small bundle wrapped snugly in a blue blanket. "Congratulations, Mr. Gordon. It's a boy," the nurse said, her smile strained. Joseph reached out, eager to embrace his firstborn, but the moment his eyes met the child's face, his excitement faltered. The baby had unusual features: almond-shaped eyes, a flattened bridge of the nose, and a tongue that slightly protruded. What's wrong with him, Joseph?" asked, his voice heavy with shock. The nurse hesitated, taking a steadying breath. "Mr. Gordon, your son shows characteristics of Down syndrome. The pediatrician will be here soon to discuss." Joseph cut her off abruptly, his voice cold. "No, that can't be. There's no way. Gordons don't have defects." Just then, the doctor appeared, stepping out of the delivery room. "Mr. Gordon, your wife is resting now. Perhaps we should talk privately." Still holding the baby, though now with visible discomfort, Joseph followed the doctor into a nearby office. The doctor began to explain the condition, but Joseph wasn't fully listening. His thoughts were spiraling. How would this affect his image, his business, his social standing? He finally interrupted the doctor. "There must be other options, somewhere specialized, maybe even adoption." The doctor looked at him, taken aback. "Mr. Gordon, I understand this is difficult, but your son is a person who needs love and care, not a situation to be handled or discarded." Joseph stood abruptly, anger rising in his chest. "You don't understand. You have no idea what this means for someone in my position," he stormed out, leaving the baby behind in the doctor's arms. Joseph made his way to Carolina's room, his mind reeling. She looked up, weak but hopeful. "Honey, how's our baby?" she asked softly. "Carolina, we need to talk. He's not normal." The following hours were filled with emotional chaos. Carolina wept, pleading for compassion, but in the end she yielded to Joseph's unrelenting demands to hide the truth. "Think of our reputation, our future," he pressed. "We can't let this ruin everything we've worked for." 3 days later, the Gordons left the hospital, their son Mike nestled in their arms, but instead of the grand announcements or celebrations that typically followed such an event, there was only silence. They quickly moved into a new mansion on the outskirts of the city, distancing themselves from prying eyes. Months passed, and the mansion became a fortress of secret. Mike, now nearly 2 years old, spent his days isolated, confined to a room cared for only by a nanny who had signed strict non-disclosure agreements. One morning, Joseph and Carolina were having breakfast on the terrace. Carolina's eyes wandered to the expansive garden. "We need a new gardener," she said absent-mindedly. "The last one quit yesterday," Joseph grumbled, without lowering his newspaper. "Hire whoever you want, just make sure they sign the confidentiality agreement," he added. Carolina sighed, her voice soft but filled with sadness. "Joseph, don't you think we're going too far? Maybe we're being—" Joseph lowered his paper sharply, his voice hard. What too careful, too smart? We've been over this, Carolina. This is what's best for everyone." His words were firm, but they were laced with the fear of exposure. Tears welled in Carolina's eyes. "But he's our son." Joseph, growing frustrated, stood up. "He's a genetic mistake, Colina, one that could destroy everything we've built." He turned and walked away, leaving Carolina quietly weeping, her heart heavy with regret, upstairs, unaware of the turmoil below. Little Mike played alone in his room, oblivious to the world outside his walls, and so their lives continued, bound in secrecy and shame, while Mike, locked away, grew up isolated from the love and care he deserved. The previous gardener quit yesterday, Joseph grunted, barely lowering his newspaper. "Hire anyone you want, just make sure they sign the confidentiality agreement." Carolina let out a heavy sigh. "Joseph, don't you think we're being a little too—" She hesitated. "Too what?" Joseph snapped, dropping the newspaper to glare at her. "Too cautious, too smart," he shot back. "We've been through this, Carolina. It's what's best for everyone." "But he's our son," Carolina whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. Joseph stood abruptly, frustrated. "It's a genetic flaw, Carolina. It could ruin everything we've worked for." End of discussion. He stormed away, leaving Carolina sobbing quietly upstairs. Unaware of the argument below, little Mike played alone in his room, a room that felt more like a prison than a nursery. A few days later, David Robinson, a middle-aged man with gentle, humble eyes, arrived at the Gordon estate to apply for the gardener's position. "Welcome, Mr. Robinson," the butler greeted him coldly. "Mrs. Gordon will be with you shortly. In the meantime, I need you to sign this." He handed David a thick document. As David read the title, confidentiality agreement, he raised an eyebrow in confusion. "Is this normal for a gardener's job?" he asked. The butler shot him a disdainful look. "In this household, Mr. Robinson, discretion is just as important as knowing how to trim a hedge if that's a problem you can leave David in desperate need of. The job reluctantly signed the document. Just as Carolina entered the room, Mr. Robinson, she said, sizing him up with a sharp gaze. I understand you have experience with gardens. Yes, Ma, I am. David replied, I've worked in various states handling everything from. Before he could finish, Carolina interrupted him. The job is yours. Jorge will explain your duties and show you where you are allowed and not allowed to go. Remember, discretion is key here. David couldn't help but be intrigued by the air of secrecy that seemed to shroud the mansion. Over the following weeks he worked diligently in the gardens, all the while sensing the palpable tension that hung over the estate. The staff spoke in hushed tones and steered clear of certain areas of the house. One afternoon, while trimming bushes near the back of the house, David heard a strange sound coming from a small window above. Curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously approached. Through the window he saw a young boy, no more than 2, sitting alone in a room that felt disturbingly like a cross between a nursery and a jail cell. David was so startled that he nearly stumbled. Who was this child? Why was he locked away like that? His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by Carolina's sharp voice. Mr. Robinson, what exactly do you think you're doing? David quickly backed down. I'm sorry, Mrs. Gordon, he stammered. I was just working on the plants, and that area is off limits, Carolina said firmly. Get back to the front garden and remember the confidentiality agreement, she added sternly. That night David couldn't sleep, haunted by the image of the lonely child locked away. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Against his better judgment, he decided to investigate further, knowing full well that he was risking his job. The next day David seized the opportunity. When the house seemed unusually quiet, he snuck into the attic and to his surprise found the door to the mysterious room unlocked. Inside, the little boy was sitting on the floor quietly playing with a few colorful blocks. Hello, little one, David whispered, crouching down beside him. The child gazed up at him with wide, curious eyes, but didn't say a word. Immediately David recognized the distinctive features of Down syndrome. I'm David, he said softly, kneeling beside the boy. What's your name? The boy simply smiled and handed him a block. Just as David was about to take it, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Panicking, he hid in a nearby closet. The door creaked open, and an older woman, most likely the nanny, entered. Time to eat, Mike, she said in a monotone, placing a tray on a small table. Mike, the boy repeated slowly, struggling to pronounce the word. The nanny sighed impatiently. Yes, that's your name. Not that it matters. You never respond the way you should. David watched in disbelief as the woman fed Mike with no affection, her movements mechanical and cold. Once she left, David emerged from his hiding spot. Mike smiled as if he had been waiting for David to return. Mike, David whispered, kneeling back down. Do you want to know a secret? The boy's eyes lit up with excitement. Plants are magical, David whispered, smiling. They grow, they change, and they give us life. Someday, I'll show you the garden. For the next few weeks, David returned to visit Mike in secret, teaching him about flowers and telling him stories. Slowly but surely, Mike began to speak more, though his words were still hesitant and faltering. One day, David brought a hidden flower to show Mike, when suddenly the door flew open. Joseph Gordon stormed in, his face contorted with fury. What the hell is going on here? He bellowed. David stood up, instinctively positioning himself between Joseph and Mike. Mr. Gordon, I can explain. There's nothing to explain, Joseph cut him off, his voice seething with rage. You're fired. Get out of my house. Mr. Gordon, I can explain, David began, but Joseph's voice thundered over him. There's nothing to explain. You're fired. Get out of my house right now. Carolina, drawn to the commotion, appeared at the door. Joseph, what on earth is going on? She asked, bewildered. Joseph sneered, pointing at Mike. This gardener has been getting too close to the mistake. He spat with venom. It's not a mistake, David interrupted firmly, his voice steady. He's a child, a human being. He deserves love and care. Carolina glanced down at Mike, who was gripping David's leg tightly, his small body trembling with fear. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she truly saw her son. Her heart stirred with something long buried. Joseph, she whispered, her voice faltering. Maybe we should know. Joseph barked, cutting her off sharply. We made our choice already. He's going to that facility next week. End of story. David's heart sank, his chest tightening painfully. You're sending him away? He asked, disbelief coloring his words. Joseph's cold stare drilled into him. That's none of your concern. Now get out before I call the cops. David looked down at Mike, then back to Carolina, who stood frozen, torn between duty and emotion. At last David took a deep breath and spoke with quiet resolve. I'll take care of him, he said. Silence filled the room, the air thick with tension, as Joseph stared at him, incredulous. What did you just say? Joseph demanded, as if he hadn't heard correctly. I said I'll take care of Mike, David repeated, standing tall. My wife and I can't have children. We can give him the love and care he deserves. For a moment Joseph's face softened, conflicted. Carolina's eyes welled with tears as she looked at her husband. Joseph, maybe, she started, her voice barely a whisper. After a long pause, Joseph relented, though his words were still cold. Fine, take him, but you'll sign papers giving up any future claim, and you will never speak of this to anyone ever. David nodded, understanding that this was Mike's only chance at a real life. Carolina knelt beside Mike, gently running her fingers through his hair, something she hadn't done in years. I'm sorry, she whispered. The apology meant more for herself than for the boy who had known so little of her affection that evening. David left the Gordon estate with Mike cradled in his arms. The boy, confused but trusting, wrapped his arms around David's neck. Where are we going? Mike asked in a small, innocent voice. David, with tears brimming in his eyes, smiled softly. Home, Mike. We're going home. As they walked beneath the blanket of stars, David spoke to Mike about the garden they would tend together, the flowers they'd plant, and the love waiting for him in their humble home. Mike listened intently, not quite grasping the enormity of the change in his life, but for the first time he felt the warmth of unconditional love. Back in the Gordon mansion, one by one, the light dimmed. Carolina sat alone, weeping silently in her room, while Joseph poured himself a drink, trying to convince himself that he had made the right decision for the sake of his reputation, his wealth. But fate, much like a patient gardener, had already begun planting the seeds of a future. None of them could foresee in a future where Mike, once dismissed as a mistake, would grow and prove just how wrong those who rejected him were. David carried the boy in his arms, his steps slow but steady. Mike, worn out by the day's overwhelming events, had drifted into sleep. The sun was setting as they finally reached the edge of the city, where the streets were quieter and the houses smaller. David stopped in front of a simple home with an untended yard, its charm hidden beneath years of neglect. He gently whispered, Mike, wake up. We're home. The boy stirred, opening his eyes with a dazed look, uncertain of where he was. Home, he mumbled softly, as if the word was unfamiliar. David gave a weary yet hopeful smile. Yes, your new home. Just as they approached the door, it swung open. A woman in her middle years rushed out, worry etched across her face. David, where on earth have you been? I was so scared. Her voice trailed off as she noticed the boy cradled in her husband's arms. She started, her mouth slightly agape, eyes darting between David and the child. Who is this? David sighed deeply, his exhaustion apparent. It's a long story, Helena. Let's go inside. It's cold, and I'll explain everything inside. David gently laid Mike on the couch, covering him with a blanket. The boy, still exhausted, slipped back into sleep almost instantly. David sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he began recounting the events at the Gordon mansion. His voice cracked with emotion as he described how Mike had been treated, the cruelty masked as indifference. They treated him like he was some burden, a shameful secret they needed to hide. He's just a child, Elena, a little boy who needs love. Elena listened quietly, her expression a blend of disbelief, sorrow, and compassion. When David finished, she stood, walking over to the sofa where Mike lay sleeping. She gazed at his peaceful face, noting the features that marked him as different, the very features that made him so vulnerable in a world unkind to difference. For a moment the room was filled with the quiet sounds of the boy's soft breathing. David's voice was low as he came to stand beside her. We've always wanted a child, but this is a huge responsibility. He'll need so much care, constant attention. Our whole life will change. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his voice barely above a whisper. I know it won't be easy, but look at him, Elena. Doesn't he deserve a chance, a family that will love him for who he is? Tears filled Elena's eyes as she turned to face David. She looked at him, then back at Mike, her heart swelling with both fear and an overwhelming sense of compassion. You're right, she whispered, her voice soft but certain. It won't be easy, but we'll face it together. Mike will be our son, and we'll love him with everything we have. In that moment they stood united in their decision, ready to embrace the unknown future. The following morning Mike awoke disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. A flicker of fear crossed his face, but then he noticed David and Elena sitting beside him, their expressions full of warmth and reassurance. Elena rose to prepare breakfast, while David remained close, choosing his words carefully. Mike, David began gently, remember how I told you we were going home? Well, this is it. This is your new home. Elena and we going to be your new parents. How does that sound to you? Mike took a moment, his gaze wandering around the humble but cozy living room. After a pause, he turned to David, his face breaking into a smile that seemed to light up the entire space. I like it, he said softly. Can I see the flowers? David chuckled, clearly relieved by the boy's response. Of course, champ. After breakfast we'll head out to the garden and we'll plant some flowers together. How does that sound? Mike's eyes gleamed with excitement. Yes, flowers, beautiful ones. In the days that followed, the Robinson household was abuzz with activity. David and Elena quickly adjusted their lives to make room for Mike, transforming their home to meet his needs. They purchased new clothes, educational toys, and gathered as much information as they could on how to support a child with Down syndrome. One afternoon, as Mike happily played in the newly planted garden, Elena approached David, her face shadowed with concern. David, she said softly, have you thought about school? Mike is going to need special education.